We are made in the image of God. The founders of this country believe that. And in fact, indeed, in our declaration, they proclaimed it to be a self-evident truth, something that you cannot not know, that God is the one that created us, and he gives us all the same rights. And God created us to serve. We find our greatest meaning. I mean, that the Bible is filled with this admonition that if you are to be great, you are to serve. And the greatest is the greatest servant. And so that's where you find your value. He intended the family to be, for obvious reasons, the first unit of community, and upon that we build a healthy and vibrant society. You know, I listed human dignity as the seventh of the core principles, but I say in the book that I'm finishing up that really could be the first. It is the foundation of it all, because it goes back to the beginning, that we really are of individual value and worth. And that is because God gave us that worth. And by the way, your value is completely unrelated in any way to the color of your skin or what zip code you live in or where you went to school or what your talents are. Your value is inherent because it's given to you by your Creator. You know, G.K. Chesterton...
This is also... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Chesterton, famously said that America is the only nation in the world that was founded upon a creed and is listed with almost theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. And that is our creed in short summary. It's the second paragraph of the Declaration. And that our nation was built upon that idea. As you note rightly, we began to deviate from that idea about 50 or 60 years ago or so, a little bit longer, and that is why we're at the hopeless result that we are. So I believe we have to get back to those founding principles because it's good for everyone.
I also think that conservatives have done a pretty poor job of defending that. So you see this vitriolic accusation arising from the radical left that the West in general, and the United States perhaps in particular, was founded fundamentally on a doctrine that was akin to the promotion of something like oppression and slavery. Now, that's a typical leftist trope, because the leftists think every form of social organization is founded on nothing but exploitation. But what disturbs me about that is that it's also counterproductive in relationship even to the stated goals of the leftists, because the way I look at things, and I can't see how this is wrong, is that the careless self-evident axiom of human social interaction is something like, if I can force you to do something, I have the right to do it. Which is, well, if I'm more powerful than you and I can compel you to do my bidding, why the hell shouldn't I? And that means that, as Hobbes pointed out, let's say the philosopher Thomas Hobbes rather than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that vision is predicated on an idea that in the state of nature, human beings aren't noble savages. It's more like life is nasty, brutish, and short. And, I don't believe that Hobbes was 100% right, nor do I believe that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was 100% right. I think we have an implicit capacity for evil and an implicit capacity for good, and that we're battling between that all the time. But I cannot read the history of the West, Great Britain in particular, and then the US emerging out of that context, as anything but the struggle of the idea that all men have intrinsic, all human beings, as you said, regardless of creed or color or ethnicity or intelligence or any local attribute whatsoever, that because of that intrinsic dignity, the anything that smacks of slavery and compulsion is in fact fundamentally ethically wrong. And atheistic types who go after the idea that the dignity of human beings is predicated on something like their formation in the image of God still have the problem of trying to sort out then what is it that gives people that intrinsic dignity and worth, because if you abandon that as a self-evident principle, so that would be as a fundamental religious or sacred principle, that's in some sense independent even of your religious belief. It's still a deep and foundational principle, that presumption of intrinsic value, that fights against the very institution of slavery. And as far as I can tell, that's exactly the reason why slavery was eradicated, despite its unbelievable prevalence throughout the entire course of human history. So the leftists, in some sense, decry the use of power and corruption and claim that the West and the United States are fundamentally slave-predicated oppressive states. But what they fail to contend with, and what conservatives haven't done a good job of defending, is that that's not only a lie, it's the opposite of the truth, is that these Western democracies that privilege human dignity are the only societies in the entire history of humanity that have ever managed to make a moral case against the principle that might makes right.
That is precisely right. And it is that belief in the inestimable dignity and value of every person because of the belief, the underlying belief, that they are made in the image and as a creation of God himself. That has been the guiding principle. That is why that belief is why slavery has been eradicated and child labor laws have been revised and all of the ills in society have been attacked. It's been persons motivated by that belief that you have to do that for the individual because of their value and their dignity. And, you know, our country, the United States, was founded upon that premise. It was not perfect at its origin, of course. We still had slavery to contend with, and we all know that it's the great stain on our history, but it was acknowledged by the leaders at the time, the principled men who were called to put all this together, and it was acknowledged by later generations as well. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said in his I Have a Dream speech that the Declaration of Independence was a promissory note to future generations, that we're in the process of making a more perfect union, and that we've not achieved everything that we should yet, but it's built upon this foundational premise. And so our first presidents, you know, George Washington famously in his farewell address, he said, you know, he gave us his prescription on how we could keep this republic, this grand experiment in self-governance. And he said, watch your federal debt, watch your foreign alliances. He gave some very practical advice, but he also said, watch out for the evil and poison of political parties, et cetera. But he also said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And then John Adams comes next and he says, look, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. They did not want to legislate that every person had to adopt a certain religion, but the point was that you had to have this fundamental premise, you had to have virtue. If you're going to have a government of, by, and for the people, there had to be a foundation of virtue, and they saw that the seedbed of virtue was in religion and morality, and that's why it should be supported.
It seems to me that even the principles that the classic liberal individualists rely on presume the self-evidence of those moral virtues. They're a given.
Right.
And the problem is that they're only a given when they're active. And when they become inactive or when they become actively subverted, then the self-evidence starts to decay. And then the whole enterprise has the possibility of falling apart.